This is Brevard Watch. I'm Matt Reed. My guest today is Dr. Louis Joseph, psychiatrist with Parish Health Networks. We're talking about student mental health today. Dr. Joseph, you talked about a concept of healthy coping for students and why students need to learn it. Explain.
Well, one could certainly classify coping on the degree of relative adaptiveness in one's life. In the mental health care establishment, we've been doing this for well over 50 years. A prominent early example of this would have been some of the work by Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, who wrote extensively on the topic in the 1960s in the psychological underpinnings of adaptive coping. In essence, some forms or means of coping are more adaptive than others. Take, for instance, say alcohol, drug use, or even cutting. Those are relatively maladaptive forms of coping and certainly can lead to trouble for a lot of people. On the other end of the spectrum, two examples would be, say, for instance, talking to another person when one's in distress, or playing sports, or prayer even. Those don't necessarily get people into the trouble that the former mentioned methods of coping that I mentioned can. So that said, not only do students really need to learn healthy coping, I believe that all of us do.
So life is a series of problems and stresses and challenges that we have to get through. If your way of coping with those things is something that's damaging to you and your body, that's not a great way to get through life. And so learning to deal with it in a more healthy way is something that we all need to learn at that stage of life when we're learning everything else, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
So right along with history and math and science, we ought to be learning how to deal with life psychologically.
Correct.
One of the issues that also I know you've discussed is pediatric depression. What should parents look for, either in pediatric depression or some of the other? I mean, I suppose it must be depression that leads to suicide in most cases as well. But I think there's probably a lot of parents watching this just wondering what kind of clues should I be looking for with my child to help keep the worst from happening.
Sure. Well, pediatric depression typically affects kids in their adolescent years, but can occur earlier. The symptoms diagnostically are no different than adult depression, but kids can sometimes manifest depression differently. And some warning signs that parents need to keep an eye out for that are easier to spot are things like changes in grades, and I'm not talking about going from D's to A's, but from A's to D's. Things such as drug use, starting to ignore their hygiene, fighting, irritability, trouble sleeping, or their child might come out and say that, "Hey, Mom, Dad, I'm depressed," or "I'm thinking about suicide."
Those are the worst case scenarios, is somebody who's going to either kill themselves or might harm others. Do you think that, and I don't expect you to be an expert on rampage shootings and other school violence, but is that the kind of thing that you might see in an extreme case of depression for a student?
Depression is a mood disorder, and it can lead to certain degrees of impulsivity. So it would not be surprising to find that in some of these rampage shootings, if not all of them, the individual had some form of diagnosable mental illness.